long before Rome became a name that echoed across continents, it was simply a place shaped by geography, water, and human need. The land along the lower Tiber River offered something rare in ancient Italy: a natural crossing point, fertile soil, and defensible hills rising gently from the surrounding plains. For centuries, small communities settled here without any sense that their huts and pathways would one day form the center of an empire. What mattered to them was survival, protection from floods, access to trade routes, and enough land to sustain families and herds. The earliest traces of settlement in the area date back to the early Iron Age. Archaeology reveals clusters of simple dwellings on the Palatine Hill made from wood, clay, and thatch. These were not cities, but villages, loosely connected by kinship and shared customs. Life moved slowly, marked by seasonal rhythms, farming cycles, and the ever-present uncertainty of nature. Over time, these scattered settlements began to interact more closely, drawn together by trade, intermarriage, and the shared need for defense. Later generations would explain Rome's beginnings through myth. According to tradition, the city was founded by Romulus in 753 BCE, following a chain of divine events that linked Rome to the gods and to the heroic age of Troy. Romulus and his twin brother Remus, abandoned as infants and raised by a she-wolf, embodied themes that would resonate deeply in Roman identity: resilience, conflict, and destiny. The story ends with Romulus killing Remus in a dispute over power, an unsettling reminder that violence lay at the heart of Rome's birth. Whether believed literally or not, these myths mattered because they framed how Romans understood themselves as a people chosen by fate, forged through struggle. Beyond legend, Rome's early development was strongly influenced by neighboring cultures. To the north, the Etruscans possessed advanced knowledge of engineering, religion, and urban planning. From them, early Romans adopted techniques such as stone construction, drainage systems, and ceremonial practices. To the south, Greek colonies introduced ideas about art, writing, and social organization. Rome did not emerge in isolation. It grew by absorbing and adapting what it encountered, shaping borrowed elements into something distinctively its own. As these influences blended, Rome slowly transformed from a collection of villages into a unified community. Paths became roads, sacred spaces emerged, and shared rituals helped bind people together. The Forum, once a marshy lowland, began its long evolution into a political and social center. What had started as practical cooperation gradually turned into a sense of collective identity. The people living along the Tiber were no longer just neighbors. They were becoming Romans. At this early stage, nothing guaranteed Rome's future greatness. Many settlements in Italy followed similar paths and vanished without leaving a trace. Yet within Rome's origins lay certain quiet advantages: its openness to outsiders, its willingness to blend myth with reality, and its location at the crossroads of land and river. These foundations, modest and fragile, would soon support more structured forms of power. And as Rome's identity solidified, the question of how it would be governed began to take shape, leading into its earliest experiments with kingship. As Rome's early communities merged into a single political body, the question of leadership became unavoidable. Tradition describes this period as the Age of Kings, a time when Rome was ruled not by institutions, but by individuals whose authority combined sacred duty, military command, and judicial power. Whether there were truly 7 kings, as later Romans believed, matters less than what this era represented. the first attempt to impose order on a growing and increasingly complex society. The Roman king was not a hereditary monarch in the later European sense. He was chosen, at least in theory, by the leading families of the community, and confirmed through religious rites. His power rested on custom, personal authority, and the belief that the gods favored his rule. This connection between politics and religion became a permanent feature of Roman life. The king acted as high priest, ensuring that rituals were performed correctly so that divine favor would continue to protect the city. In a world where natural disasters and military defeat were seen as signs of divine displeasure, this role was essential. During this period, Rome took important steps toward becoming a true city. Public spaces were formalized, defensive walls were constructed, and early legal practices began to emerge. The king presided over disputes, setting precedents rather than enforcing written laws. Justice was personal and flexible, shaped by tradition and social standing. Beneath him, a council of elders, later remembered as the Senate, advised on major decisions. Though its power was limited at first, this body reflected the growing influence of Rome's leading families, known as patricians. Social divisions became more pronounced under the kings. Roman society was organized around family units headed by male patriarchs, whose authority over their households was nearly absolute. Patrician families claimed privileged access to political and religious offices, while the majority of the population, later called plebeians, had fewer rights and limited influence. These inequalities did not yet produce open conflict, but they planted tensions that would shape Roman history for centuries. The influence of the Etruscans reached its peak during the later kingship period. Etruscan rulers are credited with major urban projects, including the draining of marshland and the construction of monumental temples. Rome's earliest symbols of power, such as the fasces, a bundle of rods representing authority, were borrowed from Etruscan tradition. Even the layout of the city began to reflect a more deliberate design, signaling Rome's transition from rural settlement to organized urban center. Yet kingship carried inherent risks. Power concentrated in one individual always raised the fear of abuse. Roman tradition remembers the final king, Tarquin the Proud, as a tyrant who ruled without regard for law or custom. Whether this portrait is exaggerated or not, it reveals how later Romans understood the dangers of unchecked authority. The king's fall was not merely the removal of a ruler, it was a rejection of monarchy itself. When the kings were expelled, Rome did not simply change leaders, it changed its understanding of power. Authority would no longer rest in a single figure but be divided, limited, and contested. This transformation marked a turning point in Roman history, quietly setting the stage for a new political experiment. The structures formed during the Age of Kings would not disappear, but they would be reshaped in ways that would define Rome's next chapter. The removal of Rome's last king did not bring immediate stability. Instead, it opened a long and uncertain period in which Romans had to redefine how power should function without a monarch. What emerged was the Republic, a system built on shared authority, annual office holding, and a deep fear of tyranny. This new political order was not created overnight, nor was it democratic in the modern sense. It was a cautious experiment shaped by memory, tradition, and the determination to prevent any one individual from ruling alone. At the heart of the Republic was the idea that power should be divided. Instead of a king, Rome elected 2 consuls each year. These men shared executive authority, commanded the army, and presided over government, each able to block the actions of the other. Their short terms ensured that no single figure could dominate the state for long. Yet, this balance came at a cost. Competition between consuls often slowed decision-making, and during times of crisis, Rome struggled to act with unity. To address this, the Republic developed extraordinary offices, such as the dictator, appointed temporarily during emergencies and expected to relinquish power once the danger passed. While these institutions limited individual authority, they did not eliminate inequality. Political power remained firmly in the hands of the patrician elite. They controlled access to magistracies, religious offices, and legal knowledge, leaving the broader population largely excluded from meaningful participation. The plebeians, farmers, artisans, and laborers carried the burdens of military service and taxation, but had little influence over the laws that governed them. This imbalance soon produced tension that the Republic could not ignore. Rather than erupting into open revolution, conflict took a slower, more calculated form. Plebeians used collective action, including organized withdrawals from the city, to pressure the patrician class. These confrontations, remembered as the conflict of the orders, forced Rome to adapt. Gradually, new offices were created to protect plebeian interests, most notably the tribunes of the people. Tribunes possessed the power to veto official actions and were considered sacrosanct, meaning any harm done to them was a religious offense. This innovation quietly reshaped Roman politics by introducing a formal voice for those previously excluded. Legal reform followed. Laws that had once been preserved orally by patrician priests were written down and publicly displayed. The 12 tables, though limited and harsh by modern standards, represented a crucial shift. Law became something known and referenced, not merely interpreted by the powerful. While equality remained distant, the Republic had taken a step toward predictable governance. Throughout these struggles, Roman identity was forged through compromise rather than collapse. The Republic did not seek harmony. It accepted conflict as a permanent condition. Political life became a space where ambition, rivalry, and negotiation coexisted under shared rules. This system rewarded discipline, service, and loyalty to the state, values that would soon define Roman expansion. As internal tensions slowly stabilized, Rome turned outward. The Republic's institutions, shaped by fear of kings and tempered by social struggle, proved unexpectedly resilient. They allowed Rome to mobilize resources, raise armies, and recover from setbacks with remarkable consistency. What began as a defensive political arrangement was quietly becoming a framework for growth. And beyond Rome's walls, the surrounding Italian world was already beginning to feel the pressure of a city learning how to wield collective power. With its internal foundations gradually stabilizing, Rome entered a phase defined less by political experimentation and more by persistent struggle beyond its borders. The Italian peninsula was a mosaic of peoples, languages, and rival communities, and Rome was only one among many. Yet its position along the Tiber, combined with its flexible social structures, allowed it to respond to conflict in ways that would quietly set it apart from its neighbors. Early Roman expansion was neither rapid nor inevitable. It unfolded through a series of wars fought for survival rather than conquest. Nearby Latin towns, hill tribes such as the Sabines and Aequi, and more organized rivals like the Etruscans all posed threats at different times. Rome learned early that defeat was not always final. Armies could be rebuilt, alliances renegotiated, and losses absorbed. This capacity for recovery became one of Rome's most distinctive traits, rooted in its political system and collective discipline. Military service was central to Roman life. Citizens were expected to fight in defense of the community, and military duty reinforced social bonds and shared identity. The Roman army evolved gradually, adapting to different terrains and enemies. Early formations were simple, but over time they became more flexible, allowing smaller units to maneuver independently. This adaptability reflected Rome's broader approach to power, practical, responsive, and willing to learn from experience rather than cling to tradition. Conquest alone did not secure Rome's dominance. What followed victory mattered just as much. Instead of destroying defeated communities outright, Rome often integrated them into its growing system of alliances. Some allies retained limited autonomy, while others were absorbed more fully, granted varying degrees of citizenship and obligation. This layered approach created a network of dependent communities tied to Rome through treaties, military service, and shared interests. It was not equality, but it was inclusion of a kind, and it expanded Rome's manpower and influence far beyond what its population alone could support. As Rome pushed southward, it encountered the sophisticated Greek cities of southern Italy. These encounters exposed Romans to advanced military tactics, urban culture, and new forms of political thought. Rome responded not with imitation, but with selective adoption. Greek ideas were reshaped to fit Roman values of discipline and order. This process of absorption without surrender became a recurring pattern, allowing Rome to grow culturally while maintaining a strong sense of identity. The decisive moment in Rome's control of Italy came through prolonged conflict rather than a single victory. Wars stretched across generations, testing Rome's endurance. Defeats were met with renewed effort, and successes were followed by careful consolidation. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome stood as the dominant power in Italy, not because it was universally loved or feared, but because it was embedded everywhere, through roads, alliances, and obligations that bound the peninsula together under Roman leadership. This dominance carried new responsibilities and new dangers. Rome was no longer a regional city defending its fields. It was a power whose actions affected the balance of the Mediterranean world. Beyond Italy lay greater states, wealthier cities, and older empires watching closely. Rome's system had proven effective at home, but it had yet to be tested against an opponent of equal scale. That test would soon arrive from across the sea, in a struggle that would redefine Rome's place in history. Rome's first great confrontation beyond Italy arose not from deliberate ambition, but from entanglement. Across the western Mediterranean stood Carthage, a wealthy maritime power whose strength lay in trade, naval dominance, and a far-reaching network of colonies. For generations, Rome and Carthage had coexisted without conflict, each focused on its own sphere. That balance unraveled over the island of Sicily, where local disputes slowly drew both powers into a struggle neither could easily abandon. The First Punic War was unlike anything Rome had faced before. Carthage ruled the seas. Rome had little naval experience. Yet Rome responded in its characteristic way, by adapting rather than retreating. Ships were copied, crews trained, and new tactics developed. Losses were heavy and repeated, but Rome endured. Over more than 2 decades of war, Rome learned that persistence itself could be a weapon. When victory finally came, it was less the result of brilliance than of sustained effort. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, marking a quiet but irreversible shift from regional power to imperial contender. Peace proved temporary. The Second Punic War brought Rome to the edge of destruction. Hannibal, Carthage's most brilliant general, led his army across the Alps in a campaign that defied expectation. Roman forces suffered devastating defeats, and for years Hannibal remained undefeated on Italian soil. Fear spread through the city, and the limits of Rome's resilience were tested as never before. Yet even in crisis, Rome refused to negotiate. Instead, it absorbed losses, adjusted strategy, and slowly denied Hannibal the support he needed to win decisively. Rome's eventual victory came not through a single dramatic moment, but through strategic patience. By carrying the war into Carthaginian territory and cutting off Hannibal's resources, Rome forced a final confrontation on terms it could control. Carthage's defeat reshaped the Mediterranean balance of power. Rome emerged scarred but stronger, increasingly confident in its ability to survive catastrophe and impose order far beyond Italy. The Third Punic War was brief and brutal. Carthage, weakened and constrained, posed little real threat. Rome's destruction of the city was less a military necessity than a statement. The Mediterranean would have no rival. With Carthage gone, Rome inherited both dominance and responsibility, ruling lands it barely understood and peoples it scarcely knew. These victories transformed Rome internally as much as externally. Wealth poured in, slavery expanded, and Roman society began to change in ways few had anticipated. Success had secured power, but it also introduced new tensions that would quietly undermine the Republic from within. The victories that followed the Punic Wars brought Rome unprecedented wealth, but prosperity did not spread evenly. As treasure, land, and enslaved people flowed into the city, the foundations of Roman society began to shift. Small farmers, once the backbone of the Republic, struggled to compete with large estates worked by slave labor. Many lost their land and drifted toward Rome itself, swelling the urban population and deepening social strain. What had once been a citizen body rooted in land ownership was slowly transforming into a divided society of immense fortunes and growing dependency. This economic imbalance reshaped politics. Power increasingly followed wealth, and ambitious men learned to use popular dissatisfaction as a tool. The traditional republican system, designed for a modest city-state, strained under the pressures of governing vast territories. Provincial administration often brought opportunities for corruption, and distant wars created generals whose loyalty belonged more to their armies than to the Senate. Rome's institutions still functioned, but their moral authority weakened as inequality became impossible to ignore. Attempts at reform emerged from within the elite itself. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, sought to address land distribution and restore opportunities for the dispossessed. Their proposals challenged entrenched interests and broke with political custom by appealing directly to the people. The response was violent. Both brothers were killed, and with their deaths, a dangerous precedent was set. Political disputes could now end in bloodshed. The Republic had crossed a quiet but decisive line. Violence did not resolve Rome's problems, it normalized them. Political competition grew sharper, and compromise became harder to sustain. Ambitious leaders learned that personal followings mattered more than institutional restraint. The Senate, once a forum for negotiation among peers, increasingly became an arena of obstruction and rivalry. Meanwhile, Rome's expanding borders demanded constant military engagement, further elevating the role of commanders and weakening civilian control. As social tension deepened, so did the sense that the Republic was no longer serving all its citizens. Veterans returned from long campaigns to find no land waiting for them. Urban crowds depended on state distributions for survival. The ideals of shared sacrifice and civic virtue, once central to Roman identity, felt increasingly distant. Yet no clear alternative to the Republic existed. Rome remained bound to its traditions, even as those traditions struggled to contain the forces unleashed by empire. These pressures did not yet signal collapse, but they reshaped the political landscape in subtle ways. Power drifted toward those who could command loyalty through wealth, generosity, or military success. The Republic endured, but it did so unevenly, balancing on habits rather than consensus. In this environment, the rise of strong individuals was no longer an accident. It was a response to a system under strain. And as Rome entered a new century, the stage was quietly being prepared for figures who would test the limits of republican rule itself. As the Republic moved deeper into the 1st century BCE, the balance between tradition and ambition grew increasingly fragile. Rome's political system still honored shared authority and annual office holding, but reality was drifting away from principle. Military success had become the surest path to influence, and armies were no longer temporary citizen forces. They were loyal, professionalized bodies whose futures depended on the men who led them. This shift quietly altered where power truly resided. Gaius Marius was among the first to recognize and exploit these changes. By opening military service to landless citizens, he transformed the Roman army into a force drawn from those who had little to lose and much to gain. Soldiers now looked to their commander for pay, land, and security after service. In return, they offered personal loyalty. What began as a practical reform to meet Rome's military needs had long-term consequences that Marius himself may not have fully foreseen. His rivalry with Lucius Cornelius Sulla revealed how far the Republic had already drifted from its ideals. When disputes over command turned violent, Sulla made an unprecedented move by marching his army on Rome itself. The city, once protected by the unspoken rule that soldiers should never enter it under arms, was suddenly vulnerable. Power was no longer constrained by custom alone. Sulla's dictatorship attempted to restore republican norms through force, strengthening the Senate and limiting popular offices. Yet, the method undermined the message. Authority gained through violence could not easily restore trust. After Sulla's death, his reforms quickly unraveled. The habits he had broken could not be repaired. Political competition returned, sharper and more personal than before. New figures emerged, skilled at navigating a system where legality and force increasingly overlapped. Pompey rose through military success and public favor, while Crassus amassed influence through immense wealth. Their uneasy partnership, later joined by Julius Caesar, reflected a republic no longer governed by institutions alone, but by negotiations among powerful individuals. This period did not feel like the end of the Republic to those living through it. Life continued, offices were filled, and traditions were observed. Yet beneath the surface, the rules had changed. Violence had become a tool of politics, armies had become personal instruments, and compromise relied less on law than on balance of power. The Republic still stood, but it was increasingly hollowed out from within. In this environment, ambition found fewer restraints. Rome's political culture rewarded boldness, and the boundaries between service to the state and service to oneself blurred. The rise of strong men was no longer an exception. It was becoming the pattern. and among those navigating this unstable landscape was a figure whose career would bring these tensions into the open, forcing Rome to confront what it had already become. Julius Caesar entered Roman politics at a moment when talent alone was no longer enough. Survival required alliances, patience, and a keen understanding of how power truly operated. Caesar possessed all three. Born into an old patrician family with limited wealth, he built his influence carefully, combining charm, calculated generosity, and a willingness to take risks that others avoided. From the beginning, his career reflected the contradictions of the late Republic, a system that still spoke the language of tradition while rewarding those who bent its rules. Caesar's rise was inseparable from his partnership with Pompey and Crassus, an informal arrangement later known as the First Triumvirate. Together, they dominated Roman politics by balancing one another's strengths. Pompey brought military prestige, Crassus wealth, and Caesar political skill. This alliance was not sanctioned by law, but it functioned effectively because it reflected reality. Decisions were no longer made solely in the Senate. They were negotiated among men who could enforce outcomes. Caesar's command in Gaul proved decisive. Over nearly a decade of campaigning, he conquered vast territories, subdued diverse peoples, and transformed his army into a disciplined force deeply loyal to him personally. These campaigns brought enormous wealth and fame, but they also created fear among his rivals. A general with a veteran army and popular support represented a threat no Republican tradition could contain. As Caesar's successes grew, so did the determination of his opponents to limit his power. The conflict came to a head when Caesar was ordered to relinquish his command and return to Rome as a private citizen. To do so would have left him vulnerable to prosecution and political ruin. His decision to cross the Rubicon River with his army was both symbolic and final. It was an open rejection of Republican norms and a declaration that force would now decide Rome's future. Civil war followed, not as a sudden collapse, but as the culmination of years of unresolved tension. Caesar's victory was swift but incomplete. He defeated his rivals on the battlefield, yet he sought reconciliation rather than revenge. Granted extraordinary powers, he reformed administration, expanded citizenship, and attempted to stabilize Rome's governance. Many welcomed these changes as necessary corrections. Others saw them as steps toward monarchy. Titles were refused, honors carefully managed, yet suspicion remained. The Republic's language could not fully disguise the concentration of power in one man. In 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators who believed they were restoring freedom. Instead, they unleashed chaos. The act revealed how fragile Rome's political order had become. Removing Caesar did not revive the Republic. It exposed its absence. The question of who would rule Rome had been answered only partially. What remained unresolved would soon be decided by those who learned from Caesar's rise and from his death. The assassination of Julius Caesar did not bring the restoration many of his killers had imagined. Instead of relief, Rome fell into uncertainty. Power, once concentrated in Caesar's hands, fragmented among those who claimed to act in the name of the Republic, even as they relied on armies and intimidation. The Senate attempted to reassert authority, but its influence was weak, its unity fragile. Caesar's death had removed a man, not the conditions that had made his rule possible. Into this vacuum stepped new figures, each shaped by the chaos of the late Republic. Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, positioned himself as the protector of Caesar's legacy and of the common people. At the same time, a young and largely unknown heir emerged, Gaius Octavius, later known as Octavian. Adopted by Caesar in his will, Octavian possessed none of Antony's experience, but he understood something essential, that legitimacy mattered as much as force. By presenting himself as Caesar's rightful successor, he tapped into the loyalty of veterans and the emotional bond the population still felt toward the fallen leader. Rivalry soon turned into open conflict. Alliances formed and collapsed with unsettling speed. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus created the Second Triumvirate, a legally sanctioned partnership that granted them extraordinary powers. Unlike the earlier informal alliance, this arrangement openly abandoned republican restraint. Prescriptions followed, public lists of enemies marked for death or exile. Property was seized and fear spread through Rome. Violence, once exceptional, had become institutionalized. The struggle for dominance extended beyond Italy. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra of Egypt alarmed many Romans, who viewed it as a threat to Rome's independence and traditions. Octavian skillfully framed the conflict not as another civil war, but as a defense of Rome against foreign influence. This narrative proved powerful. When the two forces met at Actium in 31 BCE, the outcome was decisive. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated, and with them vanished the last serious challenge to Octavian's authority. Victory left Octavian in an unprecedented position. Rome was exhausted by decades of war and longed for stability. Octavian understood that overt dictatorship would provoke resistance. Instead, he moved carefully, restoring the appearance of republican forms while quietly retaining ultimate control. Titles were refused, offices returned, and the Senate treated with respect. Yet real power flowed in one direction. When Octavian accepted the name Augustus, it marked not a sudden revolution, but a transformation already underway. The Republic, hollowed out by violence and ambition, gave way to a new system that promised order and continuity. Rome had not abandoned its past. It had reshaped it, and under Augustus, the empire entered a period that would define Roman life for generations, bringing peace, prosperity, and new challenges in equal measure. Augustus' rule marked the beginning of a long and carefully managed peace. After generations of instability, Rome entered a period later known as the Pax Romana, a time when war did not disappear, but rarely threatened the heart of the empire. Augustus understood that stability depended not only on force, but on the feeling of order. He reshaped Rome's institutions so subtly that many contemporaries believed the Republic still existed, even as its substance had changed entirely. Administrative reform lay at the center of this transformation. Provinces were reorganized, taxation made more predictable, and governors held accountable in ways previously unknown. The army, once a source of civil war, became a permanent professional force, loyal to the emperor rather than to individual generals. Soldiers were paid regularly and promised retirement benefits, reducing the temptation to follow ambitious rivals. In Rome itself, Augustus invested heavily in public works, presenting himself as a restorer rather than a conqueror. Temples were rebuilt, roads improved, and the city's physical appearance reshaped to reflect imperial confidence. Daily life across the empire benefited from this stability. Trade expanded along secure roads and sea lanes, connecting distant regions into a single economic system. Cities flourished, markets grew, and a shared material culture began to emerge. Roman law, administered with increasing consistency, offered a framework for resolving disputes that transcended local custom. For many inhabitants, Roman rule meant predictability, a rare and valuable commodity in the ancient world. Cultural life also evolved. Literature, art, and architecture reflected imperial ideals of order, continuity, and destiny. Writers celebrated Rome's past while subtly reinforcing the legitimacy of its present. History itself became a tool of governance, shaping how Romans understood their place in time. Religion, too, adapted. Traditional practices were encouraged, and the emperor's role as a guardian of religious life reinforced the connection between divine favor and political stability. Yet beneath this calm surface lay unresolved tensions. The system depended heavily on the competence of individual rulers. Augustus's careful balance could not be guaranteed forever. Succession, in particular, remained a sensitive issue. Without clear rules, each transition carried the risk of renewed conflict. For now, however, the empire rested on habit, prosperity, and the memory of chaos that no one wished to relive. As Augustus aged and prepared for his eventual passing, the question was no longer whether Rome could survive without a republic, but whether it could endure an empire ruled by men who lacked his restraint. The Pax Romana had begun, but its future depended on choices yet to be made, choices that would test the system he had so carefully built. The generations that followed Augustus inherited an empire shaped by stability, but shadowed by uncertainty. The early emperors governed a world that had grown accustomed to peace, yet remained deeply aware of how fragile that peace could be. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, ruled with caution and suspicion, maintaining the structures he inherited while withdrawing from public life. His reign revealed a central tension of imperial rule. Power was concentrated in one individual, yet that individual was expected to embody restraint, justice, and continuity. When confidence in the ruler weakened, anxiety spread through the system. Over time, the empire learned to endure imperfect leadership. Caligula's erratic behavior and Claudius's unexpected competence demonstrated that personal character could dramatically shape imperial governance. Despite instability at the top, the administrative machinery Augustus had created continued to function. Provincial officials collected taxes, armies guarded borders, and cities remained connected by roads and law. Rome had become something larger than any one ruler, a system capable of absorbing personal failure without immediate collapse. This resilience reached its height under the so-called Five Good Emperors. During this period, emperors such as Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius governed with a sense of duty rather than ambition. Expansion reached its territorial peak, particularly under Trajan, while Hadrian focused on consolidation and defense. Borders were fortified, administration refined, and citizenship gradually extended. The empire's strength now lay not in conquest alone, but in management. Life within the empire during this era reflected a delicate balance. Urban centers thrived. Public baths and forums served as social spaces, and Roman culture blended with local traditions across vast distances. Yet prosperity was uneven. Wealth flowed toward elites, while rural populations remained vulnerable to taxation and environmental hardship. Slavery continued to underpin much of the economy, quietly contradicting the ideals of order and justice Rome claimed to uphold. Religion, too, evolved during this time. Traditional gods remained important, but new cults and philosophies spread, offering personal meaning beyond civic ritual. Among them was Christianity, a small and often misunderstood movement that emphasized moral equality and spiritual salvation. For now, it existed on the margins, tolerated at times and persecuted at others, its significance not yet fully apparent. By the late 2nd century, cracks began to appear. The empire faced mounting pressure along its borders, economic strain, and the challenge of succession without clear rules. Marcus Aurelius, ruling during wars and plague, understood these dangers deeply. His reign marked both the culmination of Rome's classical balance and the quiet beginning of its transformation. The structures still stood, but the conditions that sustained them were slowly changing, preparing the empire for a more turbulent age. The 3rd century brought a period of profound instability that tested Rome's endurance more severely than any generation since the civil wars. Known later as the crisis of the 3rd century, these decades were marked by rapid changes in leadership, economic breakdown, and relentless pressure along the empire's frontiers. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, often proclaimed by their armies and removed just as quickly. Authority, once cloaked in ritual and continuity, now appeared fragile and temporary. External threats multiplied. Along the Rhine and Danube, confederations of Germanic peoples pushed against Roman defenses, while in the east, a renewed Persian empire challenged Rome's dominance with organized and determined force. Simultaneously, internal rebellions fractured imperial unity. Entire regions broke away under local rulers who claimed legitimacy through necessity rather than tradition. For a time, Rome was not a single empire, but a collection of competing centers of power bound together only by memory. Economic life suffered deeply. In an effort to pay armies and maintain control, emperors debased the currency, undermining trust in money itself. Inflation followed, trade networks weakened, and cities that had once thrived began to contract. Rural life became more isolated as people sought protection from local elites rather than distant imperial authorities. The sense of shared Roman identity, once reinforced through prosperity and law, grew thinner as survival became the priority. Yet even in this turmoil, the empire did not dissolve. Its survival depended on adaptation rather than restoration. Strong rulers emerged who understood that the old balance could not simply be revived. The most important of these was Diocletian. He recognized that the empire had grown too vast and complex to be governed as before. Instead of concentrating power in one man, he divided authority among multiple rulers, each responsible for a region. This system, known as the Tetrarchy, aimed to provide stability through structure rather than personality. Diocletian also reshaped the relationship between ruler and subject. The emperor became more distant, more sacred, and more absolute. Court ceremony emphasized hierarchy, while administration became increasingly bureaucratic. These changes marked a departure from the familiar world of Augustus, but they reflected the realities of a transformed empire. Order now required visibility of power, not its concealment. The crisis of the 3rd century did not end Rome's story, but it altered its direction. The empire that emerged was more rigid, more controlled, and less reliant on civic tradition. Survival had demanded change, and change had reshaped Rome's identity. What followed would be neither a return to the past nor an immediate decline, but a new phase defined by transformation, one that would carry Rome toward a very different future. The reforms begun under Diocletian reshaped the Roman world, but they did not resolve every tension. When Constantine rose to power in the early 4th century, he inherited an empire stabilized by structure, yet searching for unity. Constantine understood that authority alone was not enough. Rome also needed a shared sense of meaning. His reign marked a turning point, not because it erased the past, but because it redirected the empire's moral and spiritual center. Constantine's most consequential decision was his support for Christianity. Once a marginal and often persecuted faith, Christianity offered something the fractured empire lacked: a universal belief system that transcended region, language, and social class. By legalizing the religion and later favoring it openly, Constantine transformed its status and, in doing so, transformed Rome itself. The emperor did not abandon traditional power. He redefined it. Authority was now linked not only to law and force, but to divine sanction expressed through a single, increasingly organized faith. This shift had profound effects on Roman society. Churches rose alongside temples, and bishops became influential figures in urban life. Christian ethics reshaped ideas about charity, authority, and community, offering new forms of belonging in a world long accustomed to hierarchy and status. Yet this transition was gradual and uneven. Pagan traditions persisted, and religious coexistence often defined daily life more than conflict. Rome was not replaced. It evolved. Constantine also recognized the strategic limitations of Rome itself. By founding a new capital at Byzantium, later Constantinople, he acknowledged the empire's eastern strength and economic vitality. The city was positioned to control trade routes, defend against eastern threats, and project imperial authority with renewed clarity. This decision quietly shifted the empire's center of gravity. While Rome remained symbolically important, the future increasingly lay in the east. Administratively, the empire continued to grow more complex. Law was codified, taxation refined, and the army reorganized to respond more flexibly to threats. These reforms extended Rome's lifespan, but they also made the state more demanding. Citizens were increasingly bound to professions and local obligations, trading personal mobility for security. Stability was preserved, but at the cost of freedom. By the late 4th century, the Roman world was divided not only by geography, but by experience. The Eastern Empire remained wealthier, more urbanized, and better defended. The West, burdened by economic decline and frontier pressure, struggled to sustain the same level of control. These differences did not yet signal collapse, but they shaped divergent paths. The empire endured, but it no longer moved as one. And as new generations came of age, Rome's future would depend on which half of the old world could adapt most effectively to a changing age. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Western Roman Empire faced pressures that tested the limits of adaptation. Unlike earlier crises, these challenges were not sudden shocks, but sustained strains that gradually weakened imperial authority. Economic contraction reduced tax revenues, cities shrank, and the state struggled to maintain armies and infrastructure across vast territories. Administration continued in name, but its reach became uneven, relying increasingly on local elites rather than central control. Migration and settlement played a central role in this transformation. Groups long labeled as barbarians by Roman writers were not simply invaders. Many were refugees driven by forces beyond Rome's borders. Some entered the empire seeking land and security, often serving as soldiers or allies. Over time, however, agreements frayed. As Roman resources thinned, managing these populations became more difficult, and loyalty shifted from the imperial center to local leaders who could offer protection. Military power in the West increasingly rested in the hands of generals who were themselves of non-Roman origin. These commanders defended the empire effectively at times, but their authority highlighted a deeper reality. Roman identity was changing. Service to the empire no longer required cultural uniformity, only allegiance. While this flexibility had once been a strength, it now reflected the weakening of a shared civic core. The sack of Rome in 410 CE by Alaric's forces shocked contemporaries, not because the city was strategically vital, but because of what it symbolized. Rome had long ceased to be the political capital, yet its fall carried immense psychological weight. For centuries, Rome had represented permanence. Its vulnerability forced Romans to confront the possibility that their world was no longer protected by destiny alone. Despite these blows, imperial life continued. Laws were issued, emperors proclaimed, and the machinery of state persisted in diminished form. Yet each crisis reduced the margin for recovery. Provinces such as Britain and much of Gaul slipped from effective control, governed instead by emerging local powers who adapted Roman practices to new circumstances. The empire was not abruptly destroyed. It fragmented. In 476 CE, when the last Western emperor was deposed, few recognized the moment as the end of an era. Authority had already shifted elsewhere. What disappeared was not Roman civilization, but Roman imperial rule in the West. Its structures survived in law, language, and custom, carried forward by successor kingdoms that claimed Rome's legacy even as they reshaped it. This quiet ending contrasted sharply with Rome's dramatic beginnings. The Western Empire faded not through a single catastrophe, but through accumulation of change. Meanwhile, in the East, the Roman story continued along a different path, more centralized, more resilient, and still very much alive. The idea of Rome had fractured, but it had not vanished. It was preparing silently to endure in another form. While imperial authority vanished in the West, Rome did not disappear from history. Its legacy endured, reshaped, and carried forward in ways that few of its early inhabitants could have imagined. In the Eastern Roman Empire, later called the Byzantine Empire, Roman law, administration, and identity continued for nearly 1,000 years. Emperors in Constantinople still called themselves Roman, governed through Roman institutions, and saw their state as the legitimate continuation of the ancient empire. Rome, in this sense, never truly fell. It transformed. In the West, Rome's influence survived through inheritance rather than rule. Germanic kingdoms that emerged on former Roman territory adopted Roman law, language, and administrative practices. Latin remained the language of governance and learning, evolving over centuries into the Romance languages spoken today. Roads, cities, and boundaries laid down by Roman planners continued to shape European geography long after the empire itself had faded. Even in absence, Rome provided a framework upon which new societies were built. Perhaps Rome's most enduring legacy lies in its legal tradition. Roman law emphasized reason, precedent, and structure, principles that later formed the foundation of legal systems across Europe and beyond. Concepts of citizenship, contracts, and rights, though altered over time, trace their roots back to Roman thought. In governance, Rome offered both inspiration and warning, a demonstration of how institutions could sustain power for centuries, and how unchecked ambition could erode them from within. Culturally, Rome's influence permeated art, architecture, and historical memory. The empire became a reference point for greatness, order, and decline. Medieval rulers claimed Roman continuity to legitimize authority. Renaissance thinkers looked to Rome as a model of human achievement. Even modern states have borrowed Roman symbols to express power and permanence. Rome became more than a place or a polity. It became an idea. Looking back across Rome's long history, a pattern emerges. Rome was never static. It survived not because it avoided change, but because it adapted, absorbing new peoples, beliefs, and systems as circumstances demanded. Its greatest strength was flexibility, and its greatest vulnerability was the scale that flexibility ultimately produced. The empire expanded until its own complexity strained the mechanisms that once held it together. Yet, Rome's story remains compelling because it mirrors human societies themselves: ambitious, creative, divided, and resilient. From a cluster of huts on the Tiber to a civilization that shaped continents, Rome's journey was neither inevitable nor singular. It was the result of countless decisions made under pressure, guided by fear, hope, and the desire for order. In the quiet space between night and morning, Rome's history feels complete, yet never truly finished. Its echoes remain in laws we follow, languages we speak, and cities we inhabit. Rome no longer rules, but it endures, not as an empire, but as a lasting presence in the foundations of the world we know.